Hello everybody and welcome to my video on absolute value inequalities. I'm going to be making two of these for two different examples. This is going to be the first. We're going to go through the steps on how to solve absolute value inequalities, and as I do that I'll show you how to actually apply those steps. So the first step, which is something you always want to remember with absolute value equations and inequalities, is you need to isolate the absolute value. That's the very first thing you want to do. Get it by itself on one side of the equal sign or the inequality, and then work from there. So in this case, I need to get this absolute value of x plus 8 by itself. So I'm going to undo everything else in this equation, or this equality, just like I would any other inequality. The first thing being to subtract 10 on both sides. I could have divided by 9 first, but it would have gave me fractions. I think it's easier to deal with the addition and subtraction and then worry about the division and multiplication. So here, when I do that, the 10 on the left side of the inequality cancels out, turns to 0. And on the right side, 55 minus 10 is 45. All right, so I'm still not done with step 1. I'm going to also need to get rid of that 9. So I'm going to divide both sides by 9. And then that leaves me with x plus 8 is less than 5. All right, so that's step 1 right there. And I'll mark that here. This was us doing step 1. We wanted to isolate that absolute value, get it by itself on one side of the inequality. All right, now that we have done that, we can go to step 2. And just like with equations of absolute value, we need something to figure out how to translate the absolute value into something we can solve. And the way we do that is we create two inequalities. Right? By creating these two inequalities, it kind of factors in that absolute value and lets us work without it being there. So the first inequality, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the absolute value. That's all we need to do. So for number 1 here, or inequality 1, we'll call it eggs. That's the step I had. All I'm doing is eliminating the absolute value. Gone. Okay? In step 2, or equation 2, however, what we need to do is more than just remove it. We need to change the sign on the other side and also flip the inequality. So over here, I'm going to remove the absolute value just like the first one. So this is going to be the equation for B. Remove the absolute value, flip the inequality, and change the sign. Right? So here you can see that I had to flip the inequality that I originally had up here and also change the sign on the other side. So a positive 5 became a negative 5. Okay? And then, it's kind of the hard part in terms of knowing how to deal with inequalities. For step 3, all you need to do in this step is decide what kind of compound inequality we're going to get. All right, so whenever we solve an absolute value inequality, our answer turns into a compound inequality. And here, actually, some of it got removed. We're going to need to either insert an and or an or for the inequality, and that's going to depend on what inequality we have. If the absolute value is greater than the other side, you're going to get an or. If the absolute value is less than the other side, it's going to be an and type of compound inequality. So, however, what you need to be careful of is this has to happen after step 1. Right? If you try to do this before step 1, you're going to potentially have the wrong answer. Right? So it has to be once the absolute value is isolated. And then once we figure out and or, we're just going to solve both and graph. So we're going to come down here. We're going to look at the inequality right here, and we're going to decide, okay, it looks like the absolute value is less than the other side. So less than the other side would be an and inequality. So I'm going to throw the word and in here. And now it's just like solving a compound inequality, so I'm going to go ahead and solve both of these. In this case, I'm going to have to subtract both sides by 8 in both inequalities, and that's going to leave me with x is less than negative 3, and we want to bring that n down, don't forget about that, x is greater than negative 13. All right. So that's the answer to our compound inequality. If I wanted to write it as a sandwich, that's when it's all 1. I put the smaller number, the x, the bigger number, and then they're both going to be less than signs. All right, so if you don't see that connection, I'll try to show you. The smaller number went on the left. The bigger number goes on the right. You have an x in the middle. And the inequalities are always going to be less thans in a situation like this. So both answers are correct. So I don't really care which one you use. That's up to you. But if it were like a multiple choice or matching, you might not have a choice. You might have to know which one of the two it is. So that's just something to think about. And then if we want to graph it, in this case, you just label the small one on the left, the big number on the right. Right? These numbers are coming from those numbers in our inequality. And then since it is not or equal to, it's going to be open circles at those points. And since it's an and problem, it's going to be where both things are happening. And the only time that both x is greater than -13 and less than -3 is between those two open circles. Now, it didn't show up in this case, but it's important to remember to flip the inequality whenever you are multiplying or dividing by a negative number. So flip the inequality when you multiply or divide by a negative number. All right, so that's just something you want to remember. It didn't happen here, but it could happen in the future.